All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read High Risers by Ben Austen. We are on chapter 3 and we are on the top of page 56 for anybody who may be reading along. Okay, the bottom of page 56, excuse me. President Johnson's war on poverty identified these, quote, cement reservations, end quote, as a key battleground, funding programs and public housing projects with the mission of, quote, maximum feasible participation, end quote. That meant Cabrini residents ran initiatives out of the lower North Center paid for by the Federal Office of Economic Opportunity, neighborhood councils, job corps, model cities, neighborhood youth corps. Tenants took pride in their neighborhood and were concerned about the well-being of the families around them. But the Cabrini Green that Kelvin Cannon was growing up in was different in fundamental ways from the one Dolores and Hubert had found so uplifting little more than a decade before. When the Wilsons moved to their high-rise, public housing was intended to pay for itself through rent collection. By the time the white William Green Towers were built in the 60s, however, the demand for housing in Chicago had diminished. Hundreds of thousands of white residents had already left the city for the suburbs, and the rush of black families arriving from the South had subsided. To fill its 168 high-rises, the CHA accepted tenants with no screening required, some directly off the welfare rolls. Federal reforms to public assistance in the late 60s meant to help the neediest required that local authorities house tenants in order of application, prohibiting the ability to vet for those with jobs. The number of Cabrini Green households on public aid rose steadily during the 60s to more than half the total population. By the end of the decade, 60% of the families with children had only one parent at home. Women on welfare were in many ways discouraged from marrying or officially sharing a residence with the father of their children, since the presence of a man could leave them ineligible for benefits. The median income of CHA residents dropped from 64% of the citywide average in 1950 to just 37% in 1970. Public housing residents in Chicago pay different amounts in rent depending on their incomes. In 1960, rent for a 3-bedroom started at $41 a month and went up $1 for every $55 more a tenant earned annually, up to a maximum rent of $110. As the residents as a whole became poorer, the amount the CHA received from rents plummeted. Federal funding, rather than making up the difference, was scaled back as well. Across the country, housing agencies ran huge deficits. For several years, starting in the early 60s, the CHA switched to fixed rents. $80 for a 3-bedroom or $140 for the same unit if a family earned above a certain threshold. It was simpler and did away with tenants hiding income, but it was harder on the poorest families on welfare. Edward Brooke, a Massachusetts Republican and the first African American ever to be popularly elected to the U.S. Senate, sponsored a bill that he hoped would protect those in public housing from shouldering the burden as housing authorities scrambled to get out of the red. The 1969 Brooke Amendment prorated rents at no more than 25% of a household's income, eventually up to 30%. The law, while well-meaning, meant a big jump in what working families who've been paying a fixed amount each month now owed. Already putting up with broken elevators and inferior schools, this stabilizing force now had another reason to abandon public housing, and their departure left behind an ever greater share of residents who were on public aid and paid very little in rent. Quote, these rental increases are intolerable. Families with jobs are being forced to move out, end quote. The president of the Cabrini Green Tenant Council wrote in a letter sent to the city, state, and federal officials, quote, the small savings to the U.S. Treasury must be balanced against the devastating impact on the lives of many public housing residents, especially when other benefits for the poor are being cut, end quote. CHA properties require constant upkeep. Tuck pointing and weatherproofing, repairs to roofs and masonry, to window sills, electrical systems, plumbing, heating, and appliances. With less money coming in, the CHA cut back on maintenance. To save money at Cabrini Green and other developments, the landscape perimeters were paved over. Quote, everything became blacktop, end quote, Dolores Wilson said. Quote, no flowers, no trees, no nothing, end quote. After 1968, the ramps were also fenced in from floor to ceiling at almost all the high-rise developments, a precaution to protect both residents from falls and people below from falling objects. It also made tenants appear as if they were caged inside their buildings. With the concrete boundaries and the metal fencing, the high-rise public housing complexes took on the look of a prison. The CHA's mismanagement of its properties was also monumental. No other housing authority in the nation spent more on labor costs, and no city got less for its money. The head of the agency beginning in the 60s was a consummate city operator who regularly traded on his position in government to enrich himself. Charles Schweibel was 10 when his family immigrated from Poland in 1937, and he spoke no English. He spent his afternoons in Chicago educating himself in his neighborhood public library, and at 14 he won a citywide essay contest on the patriotic theme of, quote, what America means to me, end quote. He took a job filling mustard packets at a kosher sausage factory, and another with one of the city's largest slumlords, sweeping the offices, but soon graduating to rent collector in the rooming houses along West Madison Street, Skid Row. The owner of these down-market buildings paid Schweibel's way through college and eventually promoted him to president of the company. The man's children would later sue Schweibel for raiding the family trust fund, with Schweibel settling the case out of court. Mayor Daley appointed him to the CHA board in 1956, and Schweibel took over as chairman of the agency in 1963. Under his leadership, the CHA suffered from a bloated staff and fake work assignments, and Schweibel, whom the Daily Press liked to call, quote, Flophouse Charlie, end quote, awarded contracts to cronies. Time and again, he ignored calls for reforms after scathing reports documented his agency's failings. Schweibel also borrowed money at extremely favorable rates from those doing business with the CHA, using the funds to finance his private development projects. One of them was Marina City, the circular twin towers bordering the Chicago River north of the Loop and a mile from Cabrini Green. As an appeal to young white professionals nervous about urban living, the buildings were marketed as a protected, quote, city within a city, end quote, with their own theater, bowling alley, restaurants, and boat slips. The corncob high-risers were also key to a burgeoning revitalization of the near north side in the mid-60s that both skipped over and further isolated Cabrini Green. Chicago's white population declined by more than 800,000 from 1950 to 1970, and the river district that included Cabrini Green flipped from 85% white in 1940 to 90% black 30 years later, forming the only significant African-American settlement in the city not on the south or west sides. Yet even as the housing project seemed to expand to define its immediate surroundings, the city was already taking action to, quote, rescue, end quote, the nearby communities from a similar fate. Nearly 100 acres in this area close to the city center were declared an urban renewal site. 3/4 of the existing housing was razed and the emptied land readied for the development. In 1962, the Chicago real estate baron Arthur Rubloff broke ground on a sprawling middle-income residential complex to the east of Cabrini Green in the Old Town neighborhood, using land bought and cleared by the city's Department of Urban Renewal. The 2,600-unit Carl Sandburg Village included tennis courts, swimming pools, and underground parking. Its 9 residential towers were each named for renowned literary figures: Cummings House, Dickinson House, Faulkner House. Many of the new residents were young and white and working in the Loop, and the Puerto Ricans who lived on the cleared land were pushed farther north. If it had not been for Sandburg Village, Rubloff claimed, quote, the whole area would have gone down the drain, end quote. Cabrini Green was contained in other ways as well. North Avenue, the boulevard separating the housing project from Lincoln Park, was widened, extending the Gulf. On the Lincoln Park side, facades were remade so that entrances opened into opposite end courtyards and roads were turned into cul-de-sacs. In the 60s, a new group called the Lincoln Park Conservation Association, citing the damaging effects of blight on its members' community, petitioned the city to disconnect Ogden Avenue after its bridge passed north of the white high-rises of Cabrini Green. Since the 1930s, the slanting thoroughfare, named for Chicago's first mayor, had offered West Siders a speedy route to the beaches and shops along the lakefront. But Lincoln Park residents now said the wide thoroughfare was an eyesore and harmful to development. In 1967, they convinced the city to close the streets to traffic at 1230 North Burling, the barricades there forming a literal and symbolic divide between Cabrini Green and the gentrifying areas of north of North Avenue. Which, or no which, Kelvin and his friends could have at their junkyard games beneath the dead-end bridge. Which, or no which, Kelvin and his friends could have at their junkyard games beneath the dead-end bridge. But a couple of blocks past their housing projects, Ogden Avenue disappeared under newly built parks, townhomes, and a pedestrian mall. Okay, and then that brings us to a switching of the themes in the passage here. What stands out to me in that passage is this sentence here. With the concrete boundaries and the metal fencing, the high-rise public housing complexes took on the look of a prison. And so we see as we get deeper into the 60s that the Dolores once spoke about how happy she was to have that it wasn't concrete and blacktop everywhere, and how much she enjoyed. And one of the things they advertised is how because they didn't have the fencing and the those things up in the high rises, that it was like having a open sidewalk or open air sidewalk. Dolores spoke about how when she first moved there, she would sit out there with her and her kids playing, and spoke about how people would look from outside of there out to the yard in Cabrini Green and in the Cabrini rises and see what was going on. And so we see how at the same time that the conditions that this public housing building has are deteriorating, they're also beginning to change what the experience is like there. And we see as we continue going on the lack of a desire to spend money to help the people living in this public housing area, in the sense of the CHA didn't want to pay for this wind blowing crazy. The CHA didn't want to pay for updates and didn't want to pay to fix certain things that were faulty in the public housing. And so we see how this, again, the public housing is deteriorating. And with that deterioration, it's a reminder that the conditions that people live in is what breeds the type of experiences that they have. And so it's no surprise that as the conditions are worsening, that the experiences of the people who are living there will begin to worsen as well. And we see how the city of Chicago is isolating the people living in this public housing away from the rest of the city. We see how white flight works, and we see how many white people, once black people began to move in, flee and ran away from that area of the city, and how once those white people were no longer living there, the type of care that was put into that area of the city changed. Another one of the things that stands out here is the nature of public housing changing. One of the things they spoke about was how specific they were about which people they allowed to move in, and you had to work and make a certain amount of money to move into the area. And they talked about the two-family homes and not letting, or two-parent homes and not letting people move in if they didn't have two-parent homes. And you see that as time passes, they relent on all of those things. And that's not to say whether or not they should or shouldn't be letting people in who have two-parent homes. I'm not necessarily saying that it should only be people with two-parent homes living there, but you see that as was pointed out in here, there began to be women who were disincentivized from having a man live in the house, from having the father of their children or their boyfriend or whoever whatever the case may be live in the house, because that would jeopardize them from losing some of the benefits or using some of the benefits that they were getting, some of the government benefits that they were getting. And so all of these things in an amalgamation work together to lead to the type of experience that the tenants in this area were having. And so I just think that, in accordance with the things we read in the last episode from the previous chapter, have to all be taken into consideration when we begin to understand the why and how this specific public housing experience gets to be to what it is. But also remember, as we're reading this chapter, that these are experiences that are happening all around the country at this time. And so I think that that's one of the things I want to keep at the forefront, that this is not something that is specific or unique to Chicago. The manner and some of the ins and outs of it, of course, are unique and specific to Chicago, but the overall deterioration of the public housing, the overall lack of upkeep of the public housing, the type of white flight that was going on, the type of divestment from the area that was going on, even the gentrification, that one of the things that would begin to be spoken here is they moved out some of the Puerto Ricans that lived in the area so that they could gentrify this area under the guise of urban renewal. So I'm going to end this segment, and then we're going to pick up and try to wrap this chapter up in this episode. In April 1968, Kelvin was just tall enough to stand on tiptoe and peer over the windowsill in his 7th floor apartment. He watched wide-eyed as people broke into stores and pushed overflowing shopping carts down the middle of the street. The day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, students at the schools around Cabrini Green rushed out of their classes. Teachers locked themselves inside the buildings, waiting for the police to escort them to their cars in dashes of 3 and 4 at a time. People who filled the streets poured over delivery trucks, beating the drivers and cleaning out the vehicles of their goods. Looters tore through the local stores, Jerry's, Del Farm, Pioneer, the A&P on Clybourne, Greenman's, Harry's Drug Store, Big Frank's. Dolores Wilson watched from her high-rise as well. She saw men raid the cleaners and walk out with pants and shirts and jackets that probably belonged to people they knew. One lady left the butcher shop with a whole hog. Quote, "Where will she put all that meat?" End quote, Dolores asked herself. Quote, "When will she eat it all?" End quote. There were people with carts full of greens. The Wilsons didn't have very much to eat at home, and Dolores thought she could use some of those greens. Someone might bring them at least an egg or two, she joked. Kenny was 12, and he begged his mother to let him go outside to join his friends. Quote, "You don't do what everybody else does," end quote, she scolded him. Quote, "You do what I say," end quote. Chi-Chi was older, however, a teenager, and he was on his way to a pool hall when members of the National Guard arrived. He ducked behind a car. Quote, "Are you one of them looting?" End quote, a cop in riot gear asked him. Quote, "No, sir," end quote. But they clubbed him over the head anyway and took him to lockup. When he didn't show up at home that night, the Wilsons called the jail. Oh, excuse me, lost my spot. Okay, 1 second, sorry. When he didn't show up at home that night, the Wilsons called the jail. They were told no one named Hubert Wilson Jr. was there. But they had a friend who worked at the jail, and he eventually found Chi-Chi's paperwork. Their oldest son walked out with the bandage wrapped like a turban around his head. Several blocks in any direction from Cabrini Green, business went on as usual, and the riots were mostly experienced as a news event on TV. But at Cabrini Green, the cracks of rifles were heard for days. Shops on North, Larrabee, Oak, and Wells were ransacked. Some residents were too fearful to venture outside, and local agencies brought them food and other essentials. Crowds continued to mill about the streets, primed to vent their frustrations. Shouts went up that they should march over to Sandburg Village. The new private housing development seemed to represent everything that Cabrini Green was not, and also what Cabrini might become, since Sandburg's developer, Arthur Robloff, said publicly that he could convert Cabrini Towers into condos and make a fortune. But Cabrini residents didn't make it over to Sandburg Village. They heard about Mayor Daley's orders to, quote, shoot to kill, end quote. And National Guardsmen in tanks positioned themselves on Wells Street, the eastern boundary between Cabrini Green and the Gold Coast beyond. Police sealed off the still existing westward portion of the Ogden Avenue Bridge. Those at Cabrini were hemmed in on all sides. On the west side, in predominantly black neighborhoods, people burned stores as well as the apartments above them. More than 200 properties were destroyed. By comparison, the physical damage around Cabrini Green seemed manageable. Life went on there, if uneasily. Some of the longtime shop owners chose not to restock their looted establishments. Germans, Italians, and Jews who'd already witnessed a couple of the demographic transformations on the near north side decided that they no longer belonged. But most of the stores reopened. Cabrini residents boycotted a few of them for price gouging. The Black Panther set up a free breakfast program in the basement of one of the Catholic churches left empty by the long-gone Italians. Students from Waller and Cooley went ahead with plays, choruses, and formals. Retirees met for luncheons at the Lower North Center, and children enjoyed an Easter egg hunt with games and songs in the nearby 135-acre Lincoln Park. Quote, the curfew had taken its toll, end quote, the Defender reported of the Easter event. Quote, and the youngsters were more than pleased to get into the routine of evening recreation, end quote. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within the chapter. I think what stands out to me there is, again, the police terrorism that people of color, that black people, people living in low-income housing, public housing, experience on a regular basis. And already in this book, this is twice that we've heard about children dealing with these acts of police terrorism. Here, Dolores's oldest son was beat, not because he was looting, not because he was burning anything, but because he was black in the area that those things were happening in. And I think that's something that cannot be, there's no way to, that can't be understated. That should not be understated, is that in these areas, in these places, being black makes you guilty of a crime. Being there, just being in the area makes you guilty of a crime, no matter if you have actively participated in one or not. I think the other thing that bears reminder is that the people partaking in this looting, the people partaking in this uprising are people who have had resources withdrawn from them, people who have routinely been the most vulnerable in the society, who have routinely had the least opportunity in the society, and who regularly don't see opportunities for them to advance or for them to gain more. And so even though Dolores did not go out, and she wouldn't let her younger son go out, and she didn't, her family didn't go out to loot or to try to participate in the uprising, you've seen that she said she could use those things, that she could use more food, that she could use the greens that she's seen being stolen because her family was going without, because they didn't have an adequate amount. And I think that that's something that has to always be spoken about when people condemn looting, when people condemn uprisings or condemn riots, is two things. Is one, that the majority of the time, the people who are partaking in these things historically have been, specifically with looting, have been people who don't have a lot of things, who don't have a lot of valuables, who have not had a lot of opportunities in life, and who see these uprisings as an opportunity to get more or to gain more. And then, and again, everybody's going to have their own opinion on where they fall on that action or not. But it's still important to point out the causes of people taking those actions. And then I think another one of the things that's important to point out is that it is not simply just black people or poor people who have engaged in these uprisings, engaged in these in looting. This country has a historical precedent of riots, of historical precedent of uprisings, a historical precedent of looting. And as we've read in multiple books, black people have often been the victims of those type of uprisings or those type of that type of looting or those type of actions. We read here about when black people would move into homes in Illinois, how those homes would be bombed, how those homes would have hundreds of people outside of them, quote unquote protesting to get these black people to move out. The Boston Tea Party bears remembrance. And so I just think that when people go into condemning urban uprisings, that they don't often take enough time to think about the historical precedent that uprisings have in our society. And not only that, but the integral role that they have played in changes happening and changes coming. And then also, I think what's important to point out here is that this specific uprising comes on the heels of another black person being murdered, being killed. And I don't think that is something that can be understated. Is that I don't think it's understated, but that can be overstated. I don't know if I'm using that terminology right, but I think that it has to be a heavy emphasis and a heavy reminder that so many of these civil uprisings, these urban uprisings that have happened, have been centered around the continual devaluation of black life. Kelvin Cannon. Not too long after the riots, Kelvin Cannon's parents split up. He would blame his mother for pushing the quarrels nearly to the point of violence. But it was his father who left for the South Side, where he soon remarried and started a second family. Kelvin's aunt, who lived in another white Cabrini Green high-rise, 714 West Division, offered to help her sister with the children. When Kelvin was 7 in 1971, the family moved 2 buildings down and his mother went on welfare. Kelvin instantly made 2 best friends in his new building. He practically lived in Reginald and William Blackman's apartment and they in his. They ate at one another's kitchen tables, slept side by side in crowded bedrooms, and each of their mothers put Band-Aids or spankings on any of them as if they were her own. Like Kelvin, almost all the other children in 714 West Division had only a mother at home. Reggie and William's older brother, Richard, once counted just 5 grown men living in the entire 16-story, 134-unit tower, which was one of the reasons the boys traded stories about their gym teacher. After the move, Kelvin would no longer attend Jenner. Children in his new high-rise crossed the blacktop outside their building and walked to Frederick Von Schiller. The PE teacher there, Kelvin was told in advance, was a professional athlete and would teach you how to play basketball and baseball just like him. His name was Mr. White, and he would buy you sneakers. He would unbuckle his belt in the middle of class and whoop your behind. He would take you horseback riding, swimming, and canoeing. Jesse White really did these things. He coached every sport at the nearby YMCA, and he led the largest Boy Scout troop in the nation out of Cabrini Green with over 300 members. Since 1959, he'd operated the Jesse White Tumblers, a high-flying gymnastics program. Cabrini children did leaping somersaults and acrobatic dives over rows of their fellow tumblers at everything from Chicago Bulls games to state fairs and broadcasts of Bozo's Circus. White once transformed the blacktop around Kelvin's building into a roller rink. Another time, he and a white retired naval officer from Sandburg Village named Joe Owen created the Cabrini Green Community Sandlot Tennis Club. They painted the lines for the courts right onto the concrete, dug holes, planted posts, and set up the nets. They held contests to see which kids could clear the courts of the most pieces of glass. One winner bagged 8,000 shards. Some children told Kelvin that they spent close to 365 days a year with Mr. White, seeing him more than they did their own families. The first time Kelvin entered Schiller, he expected to see a giant of a man, John Henry in gym shorts. He imagined that the ground would rumble beneath the PE teacher wherever he stepped. But although an ordinary 5'8", Jesse White cut an imposing figure with a neck like a stone column and barrels for arms. It was also the way he stood in front of the PE class, his shirt and pants pressed, his back straight, how he instructed the students to assume a military position as they recited the Pledge of Allegiance, chins up, heels touching, and feet pointing out at 45 degrees. He pronounced his words loudly and powerfully, but without displeasure, repeating a collection of tough love maxims. Quote, winning is for you, losing is for someone else, end quote. Quote, be a gentleman first, we'll argue about the rest later, end quote. He had a dozen of these sayings that seemed from a different place and time, more Nute Rockney, all-American than Cabrini Green. Quote, I want you to be leafless, smokeless. The only time you should use pharmaceuticals is if you're wearing a lab coat, end quote. He taught to his students about geography and the environment. He taught his tumblers how to speak to donors, never to beg for anything. He aimed to keep them too busy to get mixed up in trouble, but he'd also say he was preparing them in case they made it out of the projects. Many of the boys under his charge thought, I want to be just like him. Jesse White was born in 1934 in Alton, Illinois, a city along the Mississippi River in the southern part of the state. At 7, he moved with his family into a cold water flat on Division Street, on the very spot where the William Green homes would be built. An inveterate extrovert, White reveled in the diversity of the near north side of his youth. He'd sample Greek and Persian cooking. He'd thrill Italian or Hungarian shop owners by speaking a few sentences in their native tongue. His father worked a dozen odd jobs as he struggled to find something steady, and the family subsisted on public aid for several years. White learned firsthand that welfare was not only a necessity, but also a woefully insufficient one, incapable of adequately feeding and clothing a family. But he believed that one could make the choice to transcend poverty. It might require the generosity of others, but your own rigor and rectitude were essential. As a teen, he went door to door in the tenements delivering coal, ice, and wood. He could also jump 3 feet when he shot a basketball at Waller High, and he was the first person in his family to go to college, using a basketball scholarship to attend Alabama State University, a historically black school in Montgomery. In 1955, he'd say, he introduced the jump shot to the heart of Dixie. He was a student during the Montgomery bus boycott. The civil rights leader Ralph Abernathy pledged him into the Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity. Martin Luther King Jr. was the preacher at his church. White wouldn't sit in the back of a bus, but neither did he join the protests. And he never lost faith in the institutions of the country or in his own personal ability to overcome. White was far from the only person at Cabrini Green who hustled and scraped and labored to keep the children there productively busy. Elax Taylor operated the 911 Teen Club out of the basement of the 911 North Hudson high-rise. Marion Stamps found money for the federal model cities and other war on poverty programs to open a health clinic, a youth center, and an alternative school with an Afrocentric curriculum. Al Carter started a youth foundation, a Little League team, and the Cabrini Green Olympics. Hubert Wilson had the Corsairs, and numerous other residents volunteered their time, coaching, and mentoring, or worked low-paying jobs in nonprofit daycare and after-school programs. But Jesse White had a unique ability to bridge the divide between the children in the towers and the power brokers close by. He was drafted into the Army after college in 1957, serving in the 101st Airborne Division. He played in the Chicago Cubs farm system for 8 summers, each fall returning to Chicago to run youth programs for the Park District at Cabrini. He landed the Park District job the same way all city jobs were allocated back then, through the Democratic Party's regular political machine. White's parents had brought voters out to the polls each election, and his precinct captain in the ward organization recommended him. White became close with the ward committeeman, George Dunn, a lifetime near Northsider who served in the Illinois House of Representatives and went on to become president of the Cook County Board of Commissioners, the second most powerful position in the city behind the mayor. White believed in the bonds of loyalty that held together the machine's patronage system. You were elevated so that you could elevate others. Through the party, he found businessmen who were willing to help him buy vans for transporting his tumbling team and winter coats and shoes for other children at Cabrini Green. Kelvin was never a Jesse White tumbler, but he was a Cub Scout and Boy Scout under Mr. White. As one of Mr. White's patrol boys, he put on a uniform to direct other children to and from school. And when Kelvin was 8, he was one of 50 Schiller students White took skiing. None of them had ever been on a slope or worn skis, and it was the most exciting day so far in Kelvin's life. Quote, he was that father figure who wasn't at home for a lot of us, end quote, Kelvin would say. Quote, he took us places like a normal father might take us. He spent time with us like we were his kids, end quote. Kelvin had his first real fight soon after starting at Schiller when he was 8. Kelvin and Reginald Blackman were playing King of the Mountain on the landfill beside a construction site. 2 boys from the next door tower, 1230 North Burling, came over to challenge them. One of them was Perry Browley, a star of the Jesse White Tumblers, who would later break his neck doing a flying somersault when his hand slipped off the satin of his pants and he untucked too soon. Everyone thought he'd be paralyzed for life, but Perry recovered and even went on to start his own tumbling program, teaching gymnastics and conflict resolution on the West Side. Back then, though, he was 8, and Kelvin slung him roughly off the dirt heap. Kelvin raised his arms to signal his dominion, but the boy with Perry was 2 years older. He knocked out one of Kelvin's teeth. Kelvin looked around for help from his friend, but Reggie was already in the wind. And that brings us to the end of chapter 3. And we will also end this episode right there. I think as we conclude that chapter, again, the thing that stands out to me the most is just as we're getting towards the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s, is just the continued deterioration of the public housing and the conditions around them. I think that one of the other things that stands out is the lack of men that were in the home. I think that you can't speak about that lack of men being in the home without pointing out things as things like mass incarceration was beginning to boom at this time. The black people were being arrested regularly for crimes that they didn't commit, shipped into the prison industrial complex. I think also at this time you have to point out the heroin epidemic was something that was heavily happening. Vietnam War was going on, so it was a lot of men who were, whether they were in Vietnam or coming back from Vietnam, being traumatized. There's a stat that talks about how many more, I don't know the specific stat right now, but there was a disproportionate amount of black men who were dying in Vietnam compared to their percentage in the country and compared to their white counterparts. And so I think all of those things have to be pointed out when we start to speak about the lack of men in the home. And we're going to end this episode here. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode. We will begin reading chapter 4, which is entitled Warriors. And want to encourage people to listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily. And if by the time you get a hold of this, there's future episodes out, please go and listen to those. Back tomorrow. We outside.